The art of building and tuning cars in Forza feels mystical and complex, especially when the community often states opinion as fact, sometimes rampantly spreading misinformation that often trickles down to newbies, worsening their experience and generally making the game less approachable than it should be. In this video, I hope to share my experience and tuning process, with the goal of clearing up confusion and giving you a solid foundation to build on. While I don't want to give the impression that I possess some sort of magical hidden knowledge, as the title states, I've had plenty of time to familiarize myself with the game engine. I've had about 3,000 hours between the two most recent Forza Horizon games, with a few hundred more split between Motorsport 6 and 7. The majority of my time spent with Horizon 5 these days revolves around building and posting tunes for the weekly event schedule. Before we dive in, I want to be clear that this is not a video about picking out vehicles for builds or choosing what parts to put on the car, aside from a section on tire choice. There are plenty of videos on that topic out there that do a pretty good job of explaining how to configure a build, especially for the purpose of min-maxing to get the most out of Forza's Performance Index, or PI system. This is something I will return to after the release of Forza Horizon 6. One of the most overlooked considerations of the tuning process is that building a competent setup requires the user to test and tune the car in a similar environment to where its intended use case is. While it seems obvious when stated out loud, this is a simple step that will ensure that the vehicle performs as expected and will allow the user to learn the limits of the car with some level of consistency. This is something that I used to get wrong. In Forza Horizon 4, the road system was arguably more consistent, and most vehicles worked pretty well after taking them over the Forza Stage Red route, especially those in A-Class with higher grip tires. I came into Forza Horizon 5 using the highway interchange as a baseline to set up the alignment and differential, then running the car up and down the Vulcan Sprint to finish setting up the car. While I still sometimes use the Vulcan Sprint to push the car for a baseline tune, for the most part, I pick one of the tracks from the weekly challenge series and run it as a Rivals event, which is a time trial set in ideal weather.
You have arrived at your destination.
As long as the weekly event is set in non-inclement weather, which most of them are, this provides a tuning environment that accurately shows how a number of variables will affect the car, including tire temperature, suspension and alignment tuning, and gear ratios. If both of the first two events in the tournament include wet weather, underinflating the tires or choosing rally tires might be worth considering. But this isn't something I would worry about, especially if your goal is to beat the computer-controlled players in the weekly challenges. While cars can be tuned for good all-around street performance, the street races and road course circuits are very different in terms of what they demand out of a tune. While I wouldn't consider any of the circuit races to be overly technical, they all contain sections that require the driver to turn and brake at the same time to stay on the racing line. Cars that excel at these events tend to be easily maneuverable and might be described as loose, with alignments that are fairly close to what comes standard on the race suspension parts. In contrast, the street racing events tend to be long, open events that have abrupt corners that feel like they intentionally try to catch racers off guard. Cars built for these events are typically more powerful than those built for circuit racing, and trade maneuverability for stability and consistency rather than outright pace and cornering speed. Tuning a car for these events often involves softer springs and stiffer dampers to keep the car from becoming unbalanced at speed, along with a more mild alignment that will aid in straight line grip, specifically during braking. Road racing sprints split the difference between the two, but I find that they're biased towards the cars that do well on the circuit races. That being said, finding something that feels comfortable and consistent is much more important than trying to dial in a tune and unintentionally making a car slower in the process. Whether you play Assetto, iRacing, or Forza, people will strongly suggest that you work off of a bone stock tune before you tweak anything. If you aren't a seasoned expert, this is fantastic advice and makes perfect sense. But after doing this for a while, I know what I like and what to expect out of any given vehicle. For the sake of being thorough and transparent, here's a short list of what I usually do before ever taking the car out on the road. Most of the time, Forza tends to make the standard tire pressure a bit on the high side. 29 psi is usually a good baseline for me on A-Class cars. Lighter cars need less, heavier cars need more. On circuit builds, I remove 2 or 3 tenths of negative camber. Cars destined for street racing will have at least 5, sometimes up to 8 tenths removed. Most builds will have between 5 and 7 degrees of caster, and this tends to vary wildly based on what car is being built and how it reacts at both low and high speed cornering. I tend to leave toe alone, although on heavier handling focused builds I may throw a tiny bit of toe out on the front. For simplicity's sake, we'll say that I tend to flip the front and rear sway bar stiffness, although in practice the numbers tend to hover around 20 in the front and 55 in the rear. Front-wheel drive cars tend to get more in the rear, and all-wheel drive cars will get less in the front, more in the rear, or both, depending on the application. As far as spring rate is concerned, I usually raise the rear spring rate. The front can go either way. Ride height stays low on high-speed cars, while handling focused builds sometimes get a boost in the rear or both ends to make weight transfer easier. This is another vehicle-dependent trait though. While I would strongly suggest leaving rebound and bump damping alone at first, I tend to lower the bump stiffness a fair bit and raise the rebound slightly. On front-heavy cars, I will usually lower the rear bump more than the front and keep the rebound equal, at least for the baseline tune. Brakes are fairly straightforward. Front engine cars get set to 53%, mid and rear engine cars get set at 54%. It's worth noting that the slider bar for this stat is flipped backwards in Forza Horizon 5, meaning that while the slider is pushed towards the front, it is actually set at a 53% rear bias. I do this to allow the rear tires to do more of the work and give the car more overall braking force before the front wheels lock out, along with allowing the car to rotate more under braking. Braking force is self-explanatory. While you can raise braking force to allow the brakes to come on quicker, or lower it to make it nearly impossible to lock the brakes up, I leave it at the default value. Differential tuning is a bit nuanced, but the primary goal on a baseline tune is to start mild. On rear-wheel drive cars, I almost always leave the acceleration alone and either leave the decel where it is or pull it back in to allow the car a little bit more freedom on corner entry and tune out stability issues with the spring rate and damper tuning. On front and all-wheel drive cars, I set the front accel to somewhere between 5 and 25% and set the front decel to 0. I absolutely do not want the front differential to lock up under cornering and stop the car from rotating. All-wheel drive cars get the same treatment on the rear as pure rear-wheel drive cars, setting the torque bias between 70 and 80% rear. All-wheel drive cars feel icky in Forza with any less than a 70% rear bias, and this is especially true on vehicles with a longer wheelbase. Another thing that is widely considered to be good advice is to stay away from adjusting multiple parameters at the same time. This is something that I do out of haste at times, and I strongly suggest that you heed that advice. I've wasted a ton of time accidentally making cars slower by adjusting too many things on the same go-around. In my case, this tends to be spring rate, damping, and sway bar stiffness, some combination of those. It simply isn't possible to predict how changing those 3 components at the same time will affect the car, and it won't save you any time.
While I did not set out to make a video that will show you how to build a car for specific classes, it is imperative to know what tires should be used in order to have a car that provides a reasonable track pace. For those of you that have a basic understanding of the various tire types and how to use them, feel free to skip this section. D and C class builds should be on stock tires 99% of the time. B class builds should have stock tires as well for the most part, although some builds are still on pace with street tires, especially those crafted for tighter circuits. There's a stark contrast between the power to weight ratio of the cars in B class, between the stock and street tires, and it is surprising how unmotivated some of these cars feel with the tire upgrade. A-Class makes things very complicated. There are competent builds with everything from stock tires to semi-slicks, although the cars that I build are usually on street tires at minimum, even if they are destined for the street races. Cars on stock tires in A-Class, especially those that don't have all-wheel drive, are very difficult to drive, especially with the assist turned off. Generally speaking, heavier cars need stickier tires to keep up on tighter tracks, and older cars need stickier tires to make up for inferior suspension and chassis rigidity that newer cars come with. I went through and found some of the builds that I frequently use in A-Class to demonstrate what this looks like in practice, starting with the cars on street tires. This is a Nissan Skyline R32 that mostly serves as a power build. Suspension and differential were left completely stock. Some cars, like this one, have special stock parts that give it a performance boost, and while I'm not certain that it has any on-the-fly torque distribution properties like I suspect, I am positive that keeping the suspension stock allows for it to retain the four-wheel steering that this car comes with from the factory. This ultimately means that there isn't a lot of tuning adjustability, aside from sway bars and tire pressure, which in this case is fine because the stock suspension is adequate for this type of racing. As you would expect, a car with this level of power is a handful in the corners, but the all-wheel drive does a good job at mitigating the lack of cornering grip. This translates to a driving style that mimics how rally cars are driven on tarmac, with early braking and an excessive amount of necessary power sliding. I wouldn't describe it as a pleasant or user-friendly driving experience, but it's very satisfying when that power is harnessed appropriately. Here's an even more raw, edgy experience that takes everything that the Skyline has and turns it up to 11. This Mitsubishi Lancer Evo 9 is with 100 pounds of the Skyline, has nearly the same horsepower, but has an extra 70 foot-pounds of torque on the Nissan. Where the Nissan builds power with the engine and turbo system working together, the Mitsubishi is all boost. This allows it to have long gears that pull all the way through the power band, meaning that less time is spent between the gears shifting, and less of a chance that a mid-corner downshift could upset the car and send it sliding. As with the R32, mediocre brakes need to be taken into account, along with even worse cornering grip, but it is faster than the Nissan in terms of pure lap times. The last example on street tires is a 4th generation Chevrolet Corvette ZR1. This is a car that should not be usable, having nearly 750 horsepower and a power-to-weight ratio that allots just 4 pounds per horsepower. And yet, with a centrifugal supercharger, keeping all that power biased towards the end of the power band, and the 345 width tires that do the best to tame all that power, this road rocket somehow manages to retain some level of drivability. As to be expected with any rear-wheel drive vehicle with that much horsepower, it gets left at the starting line, but it makes up the difference on the straights, and with wide front tires that match the previously mentioned street tire cars, it stays planted through the corners. The sprint races strike a balance between the circuit races and the street racing events, requiring a middle ground between handling prowess and outright thrust. For these events, I have two beloved subjects that both carry BMW E46 bodywork that demonstrate the two extremes of sport tire builds. The yellow car is a standard BMW M3, possessing the parts and tuning necessary for a build that is skewed towards tighter tracks and lower speeds. While it still has plenty of power, enough to blow the tires off in second gear, it is exceptionally agile, thanks to its high spring rates and slightly raised ride height. While this might be detrimental for tracks with faster curves, it shines on the technical sections of the track, leaving behind vehicles that may have more stability and higher cornering grip. This purple E46 happens to be an M3 GTR, the same car that you'll find on the cover of Need for Speed Most Wanted. While it retains the 50-50 weight balance of the non-GTR, it loses a bit of horsepower and weight, while gaining a bit of mechanical grip in the process. This is another car that comes with a very aggressive suspension from the factory that further trades stability for agility. Compared to a standard build, this car requires more front sway bar than typically desired to keep it from slipping out, and in general requires more patience to drive quickly than the yellow car, making it a high-risk, high-reward proposition with this tire selection. Most of my A-Class builds tend to use semi-slicks, and fortunately there was a recent weekly event that made for the perfect opportunity to use them on multiple new setups. Possessing Krager Smoothie wheels and redline semi-slicks, this Hyundai Ioniq 6 was crafted to be fast and aggressively loud aesthetically, and it does both of those things extremely well. The low center of gravity and high torque from the electric powertrain make it uniquely well suited for slower corners. To get the most out of it requires aggressive steering and braking input that would overheat lesser tire compounds. For the same event, the other players in my party all had a Jaguar XES, and the tune for that vehicle mimics the one for the Hyundai, but with more modest spring rates, alignment settings, and tire pressure. The sticky tires masked the lack of all-wheel drive well, and had similar and sometimes better lap times than the Hyundai. While this isn't a car that sticks to the meta of Forza's performance index idiosyncrasies, it does make for an extremely balanced, easy-to-drive package. To contrast this, I've set up a Datsun 510 to show what lightweight cars tend to look like on semi-slicks,
especially older cars that don't handle well out of the box. While it's still manageable after a minimal amount of tuning, it's unpleasant and edgy on corner exit. This type of build is best to drive with the assist turned on and a heavy amount of fine tuning, especially if consistency is the end goal. And finally, rally tires are used fairly frequently for a number of reasons. For cars that are just scraping into S1 or S2, they can provide a slight performance hit that can bump a car down to the previous class. Rally tires sit between sport and semi-slick tires in terms of their PI cost, but the lateral grip provided is closer to slicks than sports. Their inherent design also makes them especially useful for races in the wet, as well as being much better than the other tire compounds when driving over unpaved surfaces. The trade-off is that they are more difficult to tune for and give less consistent performance than the standard tire types. Generally speaking, they feel underinflated and soft on most cars, although this is a compromise that some are willing to make. In any case, it is absolutely worth experimenting with rally tires on most A-Class builds, especially for lighter and more powerful configurations. The easiest and simplest way to understand tire pressure and how it affects grip is this. Higher tire pressure equals less friction, which equals less heat and less grip. Lower tire pressure equals more friction, equals more heat and more grip. Tires operate in the same way that balloons do. A balloon with more air in it requires more force to contact a solid surface. This is essentially why a BMW 5 Series, a heavy car, requires more tire pressure than a BMW 3 Series, a lighter car. Unfortunately, it seems as though Forza Horizon's tire model does not accurately represent the way that tires act in the real world, pertaining to tire temperature and contact patch behavior. I have tested this with 3 different cars on 2 different tire compounds, expecting to see the cars with minimum tire pressure overheating the outside of the contact patch, and seeing the cars with maximum tire pressure overheating the centermost portion, as well as seeing the tires with less air pressure having higher overall temperatures. As you will see, this is not the case. It almost seems as if tire pressure has no effect on how the tires heat up or how the contact patch is shaped in Forza Horizon 5. So you may be wondering, since lower tire pressures offer greater grip, should I run tires with the minimum amount of air? Probably not, but there are a surprising amount of fast tunes, especially for S2 cars, that do. While tires may offer more grip with less air in this case, there are two major downsides. The first major issue that arises from running low air pressure is that tires will lose responsiveness. Grip goes from being a sliding scale to a light switch, giving less feedback and ultimately destroying drivability. The tires begin to actively fight any input, making it more difficult to drive, especially if the vehicle finds itself off the optimal driving line. And, while mechanical grip means more cornering ability, it also means that the tires will steal more horsepower. Everything between the motor and the ground takes a toll on forward momentum, and the last piece of that equation is the tires. On vehicles with 4-digit horsepower, this isn't necessarily an issue, but for everything else, this is something that has to be considered. Essentially, having too much tire pressure leaves launch grip and cornering performance on the table, while tires with too little will feel like driving in mud and take away from straight line performance. I would typically suggest between 27 and 34 psi for most setups, with a broader range of 25 to 38 for outlier setups with weird tire sizes, excessive or minuscule weight, and things like that. I know that some of the hypercars come with more than 40 pounds in some situations, and I don't think that this helps performance in most typical applications. Again, heavier cars require more air, older and lighter cars require less. Somewhat unintuitively, grippier tires come with stiffer sidewalls, meaning that stock and street tires, along with rally tires, require less air than slicks. Typically on bone stock setups, you will see tire pressure higher on whichever end of the car is heavier. For example, this Audi TT has a 60-40 weight bias and comes with 32 psi on the front and 30 psi on the rear by default. I tend to match the front and rear pressure on most setups in the beginning and come back to this later on in the tuning process. It makes sense to give cars that have issues understeering less air in the front, while putting less in the back on rear-wheel drive cars that have issues hooking up on launch or stepping out on corner exit. While it can be a powerful tool that directly affects all other aspects of the tune, I try not to use it as a crutch to fix any handling irregularities, and compared to the alignment and suspension components, it isn't something that I spend a lot of time on. Most of you guys know this, but I just wanted to clarify that more heat is not the goal when tuning tires. Tires in the real world have an ideal temperature range that varies based on what the tire is meant for. In Forza, from what I understand, all of the tires have the same temperature range aside from slicks and semi-slicks, and that temperature range is slightly higher. Being outside of that ideal temperature range is bad, whether that's too cold or too hot. In Forza Horizon, having cold tires typically isn't an issue that you'll run into. This is something that you're only really going to deal with if you're driving in the rain. Overheating the tires can happen if you're overdriving the car or it has too much power and you don't have enough grip to have the car hook up in corners. You know, if you're driving it like a drift car or something like that. It might seem counterintuitive, but if you are overheating the tires, raising the tire pressure up so that the tires slip out before they overheat and give you more feedback is kind of the goal. Like I said at the beginning of the chapter, Forza handles tire pressure and heat in a very peculiar way. Raising tire pressure won't necessarily prevent the tires from overheating like it would in something like Assetto Corsa or Beam. Sway bars, also known as stabilizer bars or anti-roll bars, control the lateral body movement of the vehicle. The front and rear sway bar are arguably the most important part of the tune to get right, especially on cars without race adjustable suspension. Not only does this affect the body roll and stability, it also has a significant effect on how the wheel alignment changes under load. Being at a near zero PI cost, race sway bars are an essential upgrade on all vehicles, irrespective of class or intended purpose. As a general rule, front and all-wheel drive vehicles will get softer front sway bars than rear-wheel drive cars. General consensus is that rear-wheel drive cars need less in the rear, but I don't necessarily agree with that train of thought. Lowering the rear sway bar makes turn-in more difficult, and I'm of the opinion that using the rear sway bar to combat a lack of rear grip is a band-aid fix for other tuning issues. While running a looser front sway bar causes better turn-in response, which may be necessary on front-heavy vehicles, it also allows for more movement in terms of camber. Cars with a stiffer front sway bar can get away with less camber, which will ultimately improve consistency and braking performance, something that is especially important for street racing events. For the majority of builds, especially A-Class and higher, I adjust for higher overall values and lower, as this helps preserve alignment and stability. 9 times out of 10 I would choose a car with sway bar values at 2065 over a car set up with 145. Transmission tuning is a fairly straightforward process that seems more complicated than it actually is. Forza Horizon is strange in how transmission upgrades affect the performance index rating. Typically on cars with inconsistent gear ratios, any upgrade will add additional points. On cars with better spacing, applying the upgrade that allows you to adjust the final drive may keep that number the same or even remove a few points. In any case, my process usually involves getting a rough estimate of how much power the build will have and taking the car for a test run to see if the stock transmission is adequate. This is something that I would upgrade if there is too much space between gears, if the transmission has overdrive gears that aren't usable at the intended power level, or if the transmission doesn't have long enough gearing, although this is a fairly rare occurrence. Here are a few examples of cars with those traits and what that looks like in practice. On cars with 8 or more gears, I will typically leave the transmission alone, or in some cases even adjust the final drive to use fewer gears to cut down on weird spacing in the higher ratios. Time spent shifting is time not putting power down to the pavement. Some cars, even with the final drive upgrade, may have spacing that is less than optimal. If you choose to opt in for one of the handful of race transmission offerings, these are the steps that I would take to set it up. First, bring the car to some place that is either flat or on a slight decline, or alternatively choose a rivals event. Adjust either the first gear or the final drive, so that there is a slight amount of wheel spin on launch that is easily controllable with the throttle. This is especially important on all-wheel drive cars, as making first gear too long will cause the car to bog down and struggle before it finally reaches the meat of the power band. Setting second gear so that it feels appropriate is not required, but can be helpful at this stage. The next step is to figure out the desired top speed. This can either be done on a straight piece of road, or again be tuned for specific challenges via rivals events. If the absolute drag limited top speed is the goal, using the tuning menu to decipher when the car is running out of power can be done by pulling the top gear in until the theoretical top speed begins declining drastically. This will get you in the ballpark, and further experimentation will ultimately give you the best result. If the goal is to maximize acceleration for specific events, I would first run the desired event and take note of the fastest speed achieved, then set the top gear to extend 10 to 20 miles per hour past that. This will give you more flexibility overall, and keep you from banging off of the rev limiter if you end up in a slipstream. The final step is evening out the ratios in between. The tuning app that I used to achieve this does not exist anymore. I have since written a script that does the same thing. It's janky in the current state, but I will fix it and post a short with the entire script so that it can be copied and used. You essentially want to shape the sliders into a logarithmic curve as best as you can. It doesn't need to be perfect to be effective, you just want to have more room on the early gears as compared to the later gears. It isn't uncommon for the last few gears of 8 to 10 speed transmissions to look very similar on the graph. The reason for putting more space in between the first gears is because of the way that air resistance works. Drag is exponential, meaning the faster the car goes, the more power it takes to gain the same amount of speed. As speed builds, acceleration naturally slows because more of the engine's power is being used to overcome air resistance. A differential is a mechanical device that allows the inside and outside wheel of a powered axle to rotate at different speeds. For everyday use, this allows the tires to keep in contact with the road without slipping or binding. On performance cars, however, this becomes an undesired trait under both acceleration and deceleration, depending on the circumstances. This is most prominent on front or rear wheel drive cars during acceleration. On cars that have an open differential, power will be routed to whichever wheel has the least amount of grip, and if wheel spin is achieved, the vehicle will stop accelerating. Since differential upgrades are free in terms of PI, the race diff should always be applied to the vehicle, except under very rare circumstances, which I will revisit at the end of this section. For two-wheel drive vehicles, setting up the diff is fairly straightforward. On corner exit, if the vehicle has excessive wheel spin on the inside tire, that indicates a need for a more aggressive setting. Alternatively, if the vehicle repeatedly tries to slip out during corner exit with heavy acceleration, this signals a need for a less aggressive preset. Those of you that possess more throttle control or have traction control turned on can get away with a more aggressive differential setup and take advantage of the performance benefits. Those that lack self-control will typically need a more moderate setting to compensate for excessive wheel spin. The decel setting is something that is used to assist in corner entry stability. As stated in earlier sections, I prefer to leave this setting at 0 or very close to it, especially at the beginning of a tune, and on front drive cars I almost always leave this at 0. Mid and rear engine cars are the outlier, as that weight being thrown around can cause stability issues that are easily mitigated with additional decel. Adjusting this tends to be one of the last things that I come back to on a build, particularly once the suspension is dialed in. All-wheel drive cars have a front and rear differential, with the addition of a center differential or transfer case. The range that I personally use for the center diff is anywhere from 70 to 90% rear, depending on the purpose and wheelbase of the vehicle. While setting this at 50-50 makes sense to get the most traction in theory, this results in a car that understeers and pushes like a front-wheel drive car with little rotational benefit from the rear, at least in Forza Horizon. More rear bias means more oversteer and less stability. There are two things that I'd like to make note of before moving on. The first being that there are multiple types of fully adjustable differentials at your disposal. The other versions have different qualities that can't be adjusted, including lock speed and preload torque. I have chosen the wrong kind by accident and found that even with the same settings in the tuning menu, they behave completely differently. I have always chosen the standard race upgrade part, but this is something worth exploring, especially if the part matches your desired purpose for the vehicle. The other thing I would like to mention is that some vehicles possess all-wheel drive systems that may or may not improve performance by adjusting in real time. There is some debate as to whether the vehicles equipped with such parts actually have the stated performance benefits, but especially on cars that have favorable default settings, this is something worth trying out. Some examples of cars that may enjoy these benefits include Nissan GT-R models, Mitsubishi Evos, Subaru WRX and STIs, some Audis, and some xDrive BMWs. If you've made it this far, I want to say thank you for sticking with me on your journey through this learning experience. This is where things get convoluted, confusing, and very subjective. For a very long time, I had a very difficult time tuning vehicles, and most of that comes down to confusion on what to do with spring rate, damping, and alignment. First and foremost, not all builds require or even benefit from race suspension. It is usually worth between 2 and 5 points, and more than anything else, cars with a good factory alignment can manage without it. While it won't display the numbers, the tuning menu will show you roughly how much camber the car comes with, and you can see this in real time with the telemetry tools. The majority of these vehicles are categorized as track toys, although there are a handful of outliers. In addition, there are a few dozen vehicles that are equipped with 4-wheel steering from the factory. The majority of these should be kept on stock suspension to retain this feature. To put it in the simplest of terms, the springs control how much movement is allowed, and the dampers control the speed of that movement. Together, they determine how the car reacts to outside environmental factors such as bumps in the road and camber changes, as well as direct inputs from acceleration, braking, and cornering. Springs support the chassis and dictate how much the car rolls, squats, dives, or compresses under load. Dampers then manage how quickly those motions happen, ideally preventing the suspension from moving too suddenly and preventing excess movement. The spring rate essentially determines what you feel through the road. A lower spring rate will translate to a driving feel that communicates less between the road and the chassis, which is preferable in the case of high-speed activity as well as rougher terrain. A higher spring rate equates to a vehicle that is more responsive, which is advantageous on builds that are intended for more track-like scenarios. As a rule, slower cars that handle better get more overall spring rate, while faster cars get less to prevent upsetting the chassis from road irregularities and weight transfer. As a side note, if the suspension is too soft, there is a risk of completely bottoming out the car, forcing the energy that the suspension is intended to absorb and transferring it directly to the tires. This will almost certainly cause a vehicle to violently break traction and is not advisable. As it pertains to the tune, the actual numbers mean little to nothing other than being a unit of comparison. The minimum, maximum, and average values for both spring rate and spring height will mean different things on different cars. For the most part, unless the car you're setting up is extremely front heavy, you should most likely have a higher rear spring rate than front spring rate. This is to assist in rotation on both corner entry and exit, as well as keeping the front tires in contact with the road surface. As previously stated, the range of spring height adjustability varies between vehicles, and it should be noted that lowering the suspension to its minimum setting does not automatically mean it will have issues bottoming out. As with spring rate, the front spring height is usually set lower or equal to the rear setting, not numerically but as compared to the overall slider position. Having a raised rear ride height can also assist with corner exit and launch grip. Ride height, in relation to spring rate and damping, has a direct effect on the aerodynamics of the vehicle as well, keeping the car low to the ground will reduce drag and increase downforce. Adjusting the dampers is one of the most direct ways to influence how much grip the car possesses. Simply put, lower values usually allow for more compliance and traction, while higher values reduce suspension movement and can make the car feel less compliant. This number represents the fluid restriction in the damper, essentially meaning that the higher this number is, the slower the suspension moves. As stated earlier, the default values for bump damping is typically on the higher side. This results in a more stable vehicle, but often ends up feeling unresponsive as a whole. I tend to tune bump and rebound damping very similarly to how rally cars are, in that they allow for a large amount of squish and then slowly return on extension. This keeps the car grippy and allows the springs to do their job, but sometimes results in situations where the car dives too much and doesn't recover quickly enough. Reducing rebound damping can make the car more responsive, but this also means that the vehicle is more likely to become unbalanced during weight transfer, making the car more difficult to drive at the limit. The typical value set for bump damping is almost always between 40 to 70% of what the rebound is set to by default, and this is why. If you were to match or flip these values, it would mimic the way that BMX bikes or scooters jump off the ground, slowly moving towards the bottom of the suspension stroke, in this case crouching, before pushing down and returning that energy in a very short window of time. Unless you want to build a car that is unstable and jumpy, you need to have more rebound than bump damping. Monitoring the suspension behavior is crucial to setting up the compression and rebound correctly. You ideally want to see suspension that uses a majority of the available stroke without bottoming out. If you can visually see the car bouncing or wobbling around, this is a sign that it is too soft and needs more damping. If the car tends to leave the ground over mild bumps and frequently breaks traction, the opposite is true. As with spring rate, damping can be used as a tool to alter the way the car behaves during cornering. As the car approaches a turn, the front will compress under braking, then lift upon corner exit. That all happens in reverse order for the rear, extending under braking and compressing on corner exit. Once you understand how dampers work and how to adjust them to maximize corner entry and exit grip, tuning the rest of the car becomes a much more manageable and consistent undertaking. And finally, we reach alignment tuning. The vehicle's alignment determines the wheel's relationship in space to the chassis. Suspension movement, wheel width, vehicle weight, and a handful of other factors contribute to this in real life, but in Forza, this tends to be much less convoluted, if not consistent. At your disposal, you have the ability to tune camber, toe, and front caster. Camber is the amount of tilt the wheels have when viewed from the front of the car. This measurement is based on the car being on flat ground at a static height. As the car moves through its suspension stroke, the real-time amount is constantly changing, and this is another very useful telemetric at your disposal. Earlier we discussed that tires are essentially balloons that transfer energy between the road and the chassis of the vehicle. While it isn't prominent in real life, if you equip a car with rally tires and a minimum of air pressure, you will be able to see the tires flex under cornering. Theoretically, on a completely flat surface and a vehicle with a straight axle, the tires would have the most grip with no positive or negative camber. In this scenario, there are no sideways forces acting on the vehicle, allowing it to use the entire contact patch to move the vehicle forward. Adding in the elements of cornering force and suspension movement mean that vehicles need some level of camber to use the tire's contact patch appropriately. Most modern vehicles have independent suspension that actively articulates through its stroke, creating that constantly changing value. As a general rule, the more compressed the suspension is, the more camber it will have. This allows the tire to tilt into the corner, which will help maximize its contact patch and therefore grip, as both forward momentum and cornering force increase. Having too much or too little camber can be a significant performance detriment. Being 2 to 3/10 of a degree in the wrong direction can throw off an entire tune. Having too much camber disallows the tire to use its full contact patch and will result in generally unstable performance and poor straight line grip. Too little can cause sidewall rollover, and in most cases results in a vehicle that wants to understeer. In either case, the tires will heat up unevenly, often leaving the unused portion of the tire cold, something that you can see in real time with one of the telemetry apps. This tool mirrors what many disciplines of amateur and professional racing teams do, and this is most likely the best way to go about fine-tuning the alignment. For all intents and purposes, my goal when adjusting camber is to have the most even heat signature between the three sections of the tire during hard cornering, with the outside heating up ever so slightly less than the inside. It is my belief that this maximizes the contact patch and allows the vehicle to ultimately maximize cornering grip. On the rear wheels, this is a fairly uncomplicated process. If the outside of the tire heats up more quickly than the inside, it needs more camber, and vice versa. On the front, perfecting camber is much more difficult as the suspension and steering create a ton of variables to zero out. Caster is the amount of tilt the steering axis has when viewed from the side. The more aggressive the caster is set, the further rearward this axis becomes. All modern vehicles come with some amount of positive caster, as this aids in straight line stability. The more caster the vehicle has, the more negative camber will be applied to the wheels during cornering. Caster, combined with your front camber adjustment, is what will allow you to build a tune that does not compromise between braking and cornering grip. This is not something to max out at 7 degrees and forget about. Just like the camber adjustment, dialing this in properly requires use of the telemetry apps. You will find that if caster is set too high, the car will become unpredictable mid-corner as the outside tire gains too much negative camber. While some cars do benefit from a high amount of caster, it isn't as simple in most cases as turning it up and running the minimum required front camber for the straights. More often than not, this approach leads to a contact patch that violently switches from the outside to the inside of the tire during cornering, leaving the center portion slightly cooler than the rest of the tire. Again, this is simply something that requires trial and error to get right. Toe is the amount of tilt the wheels have when viewed from above. Toe in denotes that the wheels are closer in the front than the rear, and toe out denotes the wheels are further away in the front than the rear. This is the same for both the front and the rear, but if you get confused, you can always max this out and see how it is affected, as this is a visible adjustment. This can get very in-depth, but I'll try to keep it short. On the front, toe in can sometimes assist in braking and turn instability, while toe out can help the car rotate during corner entry and exit. On the rear, toe in is commonly used to help keep higher horsepower rear and all-wheel drive cars from stepping out during corner exit. Rear toe out isn't common, but it can be used to help front drive cars rotate on corner entry. I wouldn't consider toe adjustment to be an absolute essential part of building a competent tune, but it is there and it is worth experimenting with after everything else is dialed in. Adjust this 1 or 2 tenths at a time. Once Forza Aero is applied to a vehicle, and by default on a select handful of cars, the ability to adjust downforce is unlocked. As with drag, downforce increases exponentially as velocity increases. On cars with adjustable front and rear aero, this allows you to add more grip to each respective end of the car. With this comes more drag, which can lower your overall top speed and reduce acceleration, the former of which you can plainly see as you adjust this. It feels like in most cases, putting more downforce on the front isn't as costly as it is on the rear in terms of acceleration and speed. For those of you that prefer using cars with aggressive aerodynamics, it may be worth adjusting your suspension to work in conjunction with that increased downforce. Some cars, especially in S2, may benefit from lowering spring rate and height, compensating with heavier damping. This allows vehicles with aggressive factory aerodynamics or Forza Aero to better utilize the downforce created by keeping the car closer to the road surface. As alluded to earlier, Forza Horizon seems to be a little less finicky when it comes to one element of a tune affecting other things, but the relationship between springs, dampers, roll bars, aerodynamics, and alignment are ever changing. As you figure out what the car needs, prominent areas will improve with tuning, while other things that aren't a priority slowly become one as the relationship between the alignment and the suspension changes. After establishing a baseline tune, problem areas are easy to identify and changes can happen in any order. But the final stage of a tune often follows a pattern of slight changes to some suspension element, followed by corrective measures given to the alignment to compensate. Again, it probably isn't as critical to do this in Horizon as it is in other games, especially seeing as how tenths gained on the track can be erased by any opponent, human or computer controlled, with little repercussion or remorse. But those minute adjustments at the end of the tune, and the extra time spent making those adjustments and testing the vehicle, often get you as the driver so much closer to the limits of what the vehicle is capable of executing. What I've found is that a tune is never truly in a finished state. Hardware changes can make vehicles feel completely different. Controllers handle steering, braking, and throttle input completely differently. Cars tend to be harder to lock up on the Steam Deck. Going from a Series S to an X or a dedicated gaming rig can often make tunes on lesser hardware feel not aggressive enough. And you as a driver will learn new things and ultimately become a better racer over time. You may be wondering why I chose to shoot this video less than a month before Forza Horizon 6 comes out, and I have a handful of answers for you. The first reason is that again, I've been doing this for a while, and I feel like this might be helpful and give some insight on what my thought process is. I've went through about 4 phases of tuning philosophy through my journey with Horizon 4 and 5, and I feel like I'm finally at a point where I understand it well enough to pass that knowledge on to others without any fear of misdirection. I can look back and see that I used to tune dampers backwards, and had overly aggressive setups on most cars in terms of alignment and sway bars. In preparation for this video, I watched quite a few guides, including those by Giron288, Oki Hoshi, Shadow Racing, and Johnson Racing, amongst others. I found that most of the information is good advice, but there are other things that I completely disagree with in some cases. I don't want to pick apart anyone else's video, and in fact, I encourage you to watch their videos to figure out what works best for you. Another big reason is that despite Horizon 6's launch, people will still continue to play Horizon 5 well into the new game's lifecycle. People will still pick up the game on PlayStation and PC for the first time, especially if the game goes on sale. And just like how people complained about Horizon 5's map when it came out, there are people who will ultimately prefer this title over the new one. I suspect that there may be more to differentiate the physics in the new game compared to previous iterations as well, although most of the theory here will probably be helpful even if there is a significant difference. And I felt like I needed a bit of credibility going forward if I continue making videos about modified cars, and sharing my knowledge felt like the best and most productive way of doing that. We could all use a refresher once in a while, and I'm sure that most, if not all, of the things discussed will be applicable to the newest Horizon game. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them in the pinned comment below. I've recently built a second channel for the purpose of posting less formal content like tuning sessions and other gameplay footage, and the first few videos uploaded will be focused on builds and tuning configurations that I'm particularly proud of, starting with the Jaguar XES shown earlier in the video. If this video was helpful, now's the time to leave a like. Until next time, this is Racecar Dev signing off.